महाराष्ट्र तत्वज्ञान परिषद and Adarsh Arts and Commerce College, Kulgaon, Badlapur. We feel to be privileged to invite international scholar Panos Iliopoulos for 30th Maharashtra Philosophy Conference. So I am going to give his introduction of biodata. Panos Iliopoulos is a lecturer at Department of Philosophy in the University of Ionia. He has previously taught in the University of Athens, Thessaloniki and Peloponnese in Greece, as well as the University of New York, Bogazici, Eastern Connecticut and other universities. He is a postdoctoral researcher in the Complutense University of Madrid. He has organized and co-organized several conferences of philosophy in Greece as well as abroad, and he has lectured widely in Greek and foreign universities. He has presented papers in various philosophical conferences all over the world. His articles and reviews have been published in several Greek and foreign university journals and have been included in the international collective volumes. His main research area interests are ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, history of philosophy, moral and political philosophy. He has received the Orlik Award from National Dragomano University of Kyiv in 2019 and the award for class of moral and political science from Academy of Athens in 2021. He is a member of the Senate of the University of Ionia and also a member of the editorial board for a reviewer for many international journals and editions in philosophy and in humanities. Dr. Iliopoulos has served as a vice president in the International Society for Universal Dialogue and in the Scientific Council of the Academy of Institutes and Cultures. Panos Iliopoulos has authored 5 monographs and more than 90 articles in Greek and in English and has edited a collective volume in Routledge. Thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation. We eagerly look forward for your enriching presentation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very, very much. I want to thank, and I don't do it in a typical manner, but in a very warm manner, for the kind invitation. I want to thank Dr. Pande and my eternal friend, Professor Valmiki. We have been to many conferences together. We have a long-lasting friendship, and her presence was always one of the reasons why I wanted to visit India and make many more new friends. In fact, I'm always happy to be either in India or with Indian friends because I find them as warm and kind-hearted people as Greek people. And indeed, some of my best friends in the scholarly world are now coming from India. Well, Amit Valmiki knows that I've been in India for 3 times already. I will be happy to come again when the COVID pandemic is over. So I want to thank you very much for being here and for the fact that you're interested in my lecture. I'm going to give to you a certain description of notions in philosophical counseling, but that in the Western antiquity. And since I'm going to talk about the Western antiquity, and I should say here that I understand and remember how important Indian ancient philosophy is, and particularly on the field of metaphysics, ethics and logic. So allow me to start by saying that in terms of philosophical counseling, the Greek term is symboulevin. The ancient Greek word means that I'm going to think along an issue with someone else. So, for example, we can have 2 interlocutors and they are both discussing an issue, so it doesn't have directly the form of an advice in the ancient Greek language, but it mostly has this meaning of a social bond of at least two persons. We discuss an issue together and they vulode. Vulode in our language means that they are thinking together in order to reach a decision. So the ancient Greek symboleving shows to the direction of participation, to the direction of dialectics, and advice there does not come from a superior human being to an inferior one, but in the ancient Greek context, this counseling, this type of advice, comes as a result of a discussion and of understanding particular needs. What is very important in the Platonic dialogues, and this is what I would also like to stress out to give you an idea of how the ancient Greeks think about this philosophical counseling issue, should be taken from the Platonic dialogue Phaedrus. In the Phaedrus we have this peculiar scene. There is the old Socrates, he's about 60 or 63 years old, and it's a very hot day, like in India, and Socrates is outside in a very beautiful landscape in Athens, and he's under some pine trees. It's a very beautiful landscape, but it's a very hot day, and he's an old man, and he should be resting because it's nearly about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So what is Socrates doing there in the wilderness? Socrates, as Plato describes the scene, is discussing with a young boy. The boy's name is Phaedrus, like the Platonic dialogue. So why is this important to us that Socrates is discussing with his boy? One would expect here that the boy should be seeking some type of counseling from Socrates, and that the boy has asked for Socrates' opinion. Well, this is true. The young boy, Phaedrus, wants to learn about something, and to do that correctly, he addresses Socrates because he has this reputation of being one of the wisest men in ancient Athens. But what is rather strange here is that Socrates doesn't have any particular expectation from this boy. So this boy is not an important Athenian citizen. He is very young, as I said before. He doesn't have a rich family. He doesn't have property. He's not going to become a poet. He's not very intelligent. He doesn't have from an origin that is socially very high. So why would the old Socrates stay there under all that heat and discuss with young Phaedrus? This is the key to this interpretation of what counseling would mean to an ancient Greek like Socrates, lies exactly in the element of the unimportance of Phaedrus. The fact that Phaedrus is so unimportant that a philosopher like Socrates shouldn't care about him shows us here in the Platonic dialogue that everybody who seeks advice is equally important. So, in the beginning, there is a principle of equality regarding the request of every human being who wants to be counseled. Socrates doesn't refuse to give his help. But moreover, Plato is very descriptive when he points out that Socrates doesn't do that at a convenient time. But as I said before, he does that at the time when it's very hot and the conditions are negative, and Socrates is an old man and he should be resting. So the request for counseling, and in order to relieve the young person's soul from all this agony regarding his question, is what counts immensely for Socrates. And if Socrates is there in the hot Athenian landscape, then the question is, who are we to deny our help to anybody who seeks that? But you see, what seems to be rather in question nowadays is this dimension between philosophical and psychological counseling. A modern Western person would be quite convinced that the best professional to visit will be a psychologist. So why should he have to visit a philosopher? What would be different, or what would perhaps be more functional in a philosopher's case? Well, apart from the modern perspective and contemporary perspective of philosophical counseling, which is quite clear to you, I suppose, in ancient Greek, talking to others and offering advice always is related with rationality. It's not related to feelings whatsoever. So when people come in such an interaction as the interaction between Socrates and a young boy, even at this age, when he's a teenager, Phaedrus is a teenager, the expectation from both sides is that the discourse is going to be fully rational. One of us may now doubt here and raise the question of whether such a young boy is capable of rationality to an extent where a boy like this would be competent enough to deal with what Socrates has to say. Now, as the dialogue Phaedrus evolves, what we observe is that Socrates resorts to two different manners of speech. So his discourse to the boy has two different parameters, or considers two different parameters. At one point, and while Socrates is using this rational discourse to explain to the boy what his positions would be about the particular issue, he then resorts to mania. If you allow me, I'm going to write this word, which is of Greek origin. I'm going to write it down here in the chat. I'm hoping that you may be able to see it later on. So what is mania? Mania in the modern concept is what makes a person a maniac, right? What makes a person be manic. But in ancient Greece, according to Plato, mania is not a bad thing at all. For example, there is prophetic mania. The mania that allows a person to communicate with a god, and the god through this person prophesizes and gives right advice about different events. There is also the erotic mania. So the person who is in love is able to use this huge biological, mental, and corporal force to lead other people to education and to lead himself to perfection as well, because love is a unique chance for perfection. And indeed, in the dialogue of Phaedrus, the issue that the young boy raises is an erotic issue. It's an issue of love. So Socrates doesn't hesitate to go from a discourse of full rationality and from a way of exposing fully rational criteria to the young person. He doesn't hesitate now to jump on to a manic discourse where he again speaks using rational premises and absolutely logical premises, but this time his speech is helped out with mania. Now, to understand this context even better, Socrates, at the end of the dialogue, revolves the issue about the importance of oral discourse. So if we remember, Plato is really, even though he has produced all these variety of rich dialogues, he's practically against written speech. He believes in the power of oral discourse, oral communication, because oral communication, like the communication between two friends, or two people who care for one another, or between two people who serve the same benefits, then this discourse is much higher because it allows the communication of these people's souls. So discussion here is not just a meeting of people's minds and people's rational arguments, but it's also a meeting of their souls, because they both share a common characteristic. What is this characteristic? It's their common quest for the finding of truth. I understand why truth would be important to Socrates. I still have some doubts why truth would be important at such a young age, with all the romanticism and naivety that this young age may contain. So now I will come to the example of Phaedrus more closely. Socrates' attempt to offer this philosophical explanation about the phenomenon of eros to the young Phaedrus, of course, meets some resistance. Phaedrus has more questions than Socrates perhaps might have predicted. But Socrates does not only try to give answers. This is something that Socrates rarely does. I mean, if you look at the Platonic dialogues, one of the surprising things in those is that Socrates rarely becomes conclusive about any issue at all. Why is that? So we could suppose that Socrates doesn't know the truth. Then perhaps we could suppose that if someone doesn't know the truth, one shouldn't be discussing the truth. Doesn't it work like this today? I mean, if I want to understand how an airplane functions, then I should be able to find people who can explain to me how an airplane works. But in the Socratic tradition, in this philosophy, you don't need to know the answers, and you don't need to push the answers against anyone. What Socratic way is about a way of finding together with other people, but finding how, not in a way that is not scientific, but in a purely scientific and purely rational way, that which at the same time doesn't prevent you from communicating on the level of the soul. So it's not just that Socrates explains something to someone who doesn't know. Socrates never says that. Socrates attempts to explain the arguments. He tries to open the door to the young boy so the boy can eventually see the arguments someday, so that the young boy can eventually become a wise man himself, but not by borrowing answers from the great philosopher that Socrates is. The mission of Socrates on that hot Athenian day is that this boy becomes a philosophical man, meaning a man who can have control over his own soul, his own thought, and perhaps his own philosophy, or whatever his ergon, to use an Aristotelian word, might be in his life. Making people whole human beings in ancient Greek philosophy is never about imposing them with answers. It's always about making them able of discussing the parameters of the truth, negotiating the truth, even negating the truth. They are allowed to do that. Of course, we are free to negate what the truth is, but we are also free to come back to the issue and discover again what the right way of thinking is. So practically, this is about the right way of thinking. And how could you become able to think right for yourself if not by being allowed to think by yourself? What others can do when they are our counselors is to have this role of someone who facilitates this way of thinking, is someone who can be literally sometimes the devil's advocate, the one who can show us the counter argument, the one who can make it instituted. If you allow me, and I will not go out of the context of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, I would like here to remind everyone of an existentialist paradigm. And my friend Professor Valmiki knows very well about this case of Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, as she gave a very brilliant lecture here in my university in Ioannina. So in Kierkegaard, the solution to the problem is always subjective. It goes through subjectivity. There's nothing objective about the solution. So if we could take here a prism of philosophical counseling for us to use somebody else's advice or somebody else's experience or somebody else's right way of thinking, and this is something that Kierkegaard would advise against. Kierkegaard is adamant when he insists that this is so subjective an experience that it's literally a leap of faith or a leap inside the irrational. Now you see, Kierkegaard here seems to be abandoning the rational and seems to turn against Socrates, but let me remind at this point that Kierkegaard understands Socrates quite well. Kierkegaard's PhD thesis is written on the Socratic irony, so he really knows what he talks about. The difference in Kierkegaard, and I'm using this model in order to be able to explain Socrates and Phaedrus again more. In Kierkegaard's case, reason can be abandoned because the devotion that subjectivity contains is really the catalyst for any kind of salvation. But in the Socratic paradigm, reason is always your assistant, and you can have no better than that. It's the logical premises that will lead you to the truth, even if at sometimes you have to use mania. Now, to the potential question, if mania is something subjective, again, mania, even though it takes you out of yourself to some degree, as I said, there is a prophetic and erotic and other types of mania. Again, mania is not just about the irrational, but it's about a side of the human being which does not forbid the human being from being absolutely rational. So, the way the young Phaedrus is here to see is that, first of all, he should trust this oral discourse and he should be helped on an individual basis. Phaedrus is not there along with other young boys. Would we suppose here that other young boys in Athens do not have the same questions as Phaedrus does? Of course, that would be a silly question. Of course they have these same questions. But why does it have to be on an individual basis? It has to be on an individual basis because this discussion, as it evolves in the dialogue, is precisely the discussion that this particular person needs. There can be no group therapy. There can be no group discussion about the problems that Phaedrus has. It has to be unique, it has to be individual, and Phaedrus is not shown a particular type of discourse, but Phaedrus is shown a particular type of discourse that belongs only to Phaedrus. Socrates, if he was to discuss with somebody else, with some other boy, he would use another approach. That's what we understand in Phaedrus. And here I repeat again, because I think this is a marvelous point that Plato does, that Phaedrus is really an unimportant person. He never became anything great. He doesn't belong to a heroic or rich generation. From this perspective, and if we want to look at ancient philosophy in a more wide prism now, I would say that the idea of counseling is there from the beginning. So, for example, even though Aristotle differs in his approach, and despite the fact that he's Plato's best student, he doesn't trust oral discourse as much. So Aristotle, contrary to the Platonic tradition, tends to write more than speak with somebody on an individual basis. Aristotle, in that perspective, is really the father of our Western understanding of how we are to do science. And this is by writing books, sending them to our colleagues, discussing them, and this is how it goes. But does Aristotle abandon this idea of counseling, of symbuleving, as the Greek term is? He really does not. And we can see that not only in the ethical treatises, he has the Magna Moralia and the Eudemian Ethics and the Nicomachean Ethics, and in all these books, Aristotle never gives us the impression that he's talking to a crowd. Even though he's using the Catholic to show that these things speak for each person and they have value for each person, he shows us the impression that he's speaking to us on an individual basis, which is the Greek suggestion instead of happiness. Aristotle stresses out those very interesting elements that belong to every human soul. And what are these elements? These elements are related with the human capacity for virtue. And virtue here is the only way that can guide a person to a perfect type of living. You see, quite differently to the modern Western world, which cares about happiness, the ancient Greek doesn't think happiness is possible at all.